Good morning. Good morning. It's great to be back at my favorite senior living place where I now have so many friends and have in the past. You all are always great listeners. You love history, which is obviously my chosen field. From time to time, you probably come across somebody who says, "What good is history?" And you look at them like they're stupid, which they are if they're asking questions like that. And my answer is, the best thing about history is it shows us two things. Number one, how much things change. Number two, how much things stay the same. And because so many things actually stay the same, I think, therefore, they can be applied, the lessons from history, and that's what I'm going to be doing for the next several minutes, talking about how, because of two principles that have stayed the same. Number one, to be a great leader, you got to be a great persuader. And secondly, the traits that are needed to be a great persuader are the same today as they were in George Washington's day. Now, as perhaps you've heard, I have a new book. It came out in April, so it's not so new anymore. It's been out for 7 months. The title is How the Best Did It, subtitled Leadership Lessons from Our Top Presidents. The target audience for the book is anybody who is or aspires to be a better leader in any field of endeavor. That may be politics, that may be business, that may be law, entertainment, nonprofits, whatever it may be. These lessons apply to leaders in all those fields. And the book covers what I consider to be the most important leadership traits of our 8 greatest presidents. Now, when I get through talking, we'll have time for Q&A, and somebody will probably say, "How'd you choose your 8 presidents?" I'm happy to answer that question. But in my opinion, our 8 greatest presidents are Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, both Roosevelts, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Reagan. And in researching these men's presidencies, I saw that they all had a common leadership trait. They were all great persuaders, although they all went about persuading in his own unique way. So exactly how they succeeded in persuading to cause great things to happen to our nation in their eras, I believe is worthy of our attention today, because after all, we're all in the persuasion business. So with that in mind, let's turn to the presidents, see what it was that made them such great persuaders, and see if we can incorporate that into our leadership aspirations today and going forward. Or perhaps you'll have a takeaway, as Mike said, that you'll want to share with your children or grandchildren. Our first great president, surprise, surprise, George Washington. Now, when you think of persuasion, the first image that may come to your mind is somebody standing in front of a crowd, speaking to the multitudes, persuading with the wonderful golden voice. Unfortunately, George Washington did not have that skill. He had 2 strikes against him that prevented him from being a good orator. Number one, he had a soft, breathy voice that was a result of a childhood respiratory illness, such that in the days long before there were microphones, he could not project his voice. And secondly, as you probably read through the years, he had real issues with his teeth, such that by the time he became president, he only had 1 tooth in his head. And I don't know how many of you have been to Mount Vernon and the museum there at Mount Vernon, or maybe you're going to go in the future, but the item that usually attracts the most attention in the museum are George Washington's dentures. And people can't believe that anybody could fit those into his mouth and be able to talk. It was like talking through a small bird cage. And yet somehow, George did it. And George was incredibly persuasive and effective as a leader. Well, how did he do that? Despite the voice issues and the teeth issues, how did he do it? What was it that caused him to be so effective as a persuader and leader, in that our Second Continental Congress chose him to be our commander-in-chief during the Revolutionary War unanimously. They made that decision unanimously. Our Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, all these delegates from all over the country, when it came time to choose a chairman to preside over that convention, they selected Washington unanimously. After that convention resulted in this document that they signed off on and was ratified, soon thereafter it was time to choose our first president. And American voters and the Electoral College, when it came time to choose the first president, chose Washington unanimously. And then when his 4-year term was up and it was time for a second term, again, the voters and the electors elected him unanimously. So you know you're a pretty effective persuader and leader if nobody ever thinks about opposing you for anything. And that was George Washington. So how did he do it? Well, he was a man of deeds, not words. And people knew of his heroic deeds. Think about your life experience. When you encounter somebody who you know has done great things, you pay more attention to them. You listen when they finally speak. And people were aware of Washington's heroic deeds. During the French and Indian War, when American colonists fought for the British against the French and the Indians, Washington was our most courageous soldier. He had horses shot out from under him. He had bullet holes in his hats and his uniforms. It was a providential miracle that he did not get killed in the French and Indian War. He would lead men into battle, bullets flying all around, and somehow he never got hit. People knew of his courage. During the American Revolution, which was an 8-year war, people forget, it was twice as long as the Civil War. And Washington was our commander-in-chief for all 8 years. And against great odds, we somehow defeated the British. And then, of course, at the Constitutional Convention, presiding over all these big ego, conflicting political personalities, he brought it all together. And we got the document that is still our supreme law of the land. So, knowing of these deeds gave people an impression of Washington's stature. He knew that. And so, if you want to think about or sharing with your children or grandchildren, what would it take to persuade like George Washington? The first thing is, ask yourself, are my past deeds sufficiently well known that they provide a platform for my leadership? That was a big part of Washington's firepower. But besides these achievements, he earned trust in other ways. First of all, he always looked like a leader, straight out of central casting. He was a sharp dresser. He was always perfectly groomed. He had ramrod straight posture. He moved with an athlete's grace. He always rode an impressive white horse. And at 6'2.5", he was usually the tallest guy in the room. So when you put all those traits together, he epitomized what is known as command presence. Persuasion by his mere presence. When he walked into the room, Gilbert Stuart, the portrait artist, his wife, described Washington this way: he's the most superb-looking person I've ever seen. So again, you're thinking about how can I be a better leader? What can I share with my family to be a better leader, lead like George Washington? Before you go to that important meeting or conference or whatever it may be, look in the mirror. How's my command presence before this big meeting? But he was also an effective persuader because, as we all know, he was a person of the highest integrity. And when you have unwavering integrity, people know you have complete credibility. They can take what you say to the bank. When you speak publicly, you don't have to buy the newspaper the next day for fact checks. That was Washington. Now, I'm sure you're familiar. The very first biography of Washington that was ever written was written by a guy named Parson Weems. And back in those days, we didn't have big libraries. It was hard to do research. He wanted to tell Washington's story, but there wasn't a whole lot of sources of research. So Weems did his best to create metaphors that, in fact, were fables that weren't true. In particular, the famous when he was a child, he had chopped down a cherry tree and had confessed to his father, "Father, Father, I cannot tell a lie. I chopped down the cherry tree." Well, that was a fable, but it was a metaphor. It epitomized Washington's commitment to integrity throughout his life. So again, to lead like Washington asks, what's my reputation for integrity and credibility at my company or in my industry? And then finally, in terms of his reasons why he was such a great persuader, he had a very rare trait for a politician. He knew when not to speak. Now you remember the musical Hamilton, and you know how much friction there was between Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists and the Republicans led by Thomas Jefferson. And Washington, when he became our first president, knew this was fragile. This new nation was fragile. It might not last. And he saw his main job as being unifier in chief. We've got to stay together and be unified, or this new nation is not going to make it. Like Lincoln, he chose a team of rivals cabinet in terms of he knew that Hamilton and Jefferson didn't get along, but they were both brilliant, and he wanted their insight. So Hamilton was his Secretary of the Treasury, and Jefferson was his Secretary of State. And when they'd have their frequent cabinet meetings, they'd be arguing all the time. And Washington knew not to speak in terms of saying, I agree with you and disagree with you, or vice versa. He knew that would be divisive, publicly taking sides. So his approach was, he would say to Hamilton and Jefferson, you guys go back to your office, you write a detailed position paper on this particular issue that you're arguing about, deliver it to me, I'll read it, I'll reflect on it. I'm happy to make the final decision, but I'm not going to come out publicly and side with one or the other. Historian Mark Updegrove says this in his book, quote, conscious that political passions threatened to split the country, Washington largely kept his voice still so as not to add to the passions, keeping his opinions in check until policy decisions were required so as not to add to the divisions. So if you want to lead and persuade like George Washington, ask yourself, do I know when not to speak in order to maintain unity in my organization? Our second great president, Thomas Jefferson. Now, like Washington, Jefferson knew he was not a good public speaker. He had a soft voice. And yet, he was obviously an incredibly effective persuader because his special skill was persuading one-on-one and in small groups. Now keep in mind the country that Jefferson was taking over. Between Washington and Jefferson had been John Adams. Many of you, I'm sure, read David McCullough's biography of John Adams. And that biography is probably the best thing that's ever happened to John Adams in terms of enhancing his legacy. Because in fact, he was a very divisive president. He was a Federalist. Congress was controlled by the Federalists during his 4-year term. And Adams was notoriously thin-skinned. He hated criticism. And so he got Congress to pass what was called the Sedition Act, under the terms of which anybody who criticized President Adams or any Federalist policy would be thrown in jail, despite exercising what was obviously First Amendment, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press rights. Fortunately, the Sedition Act expired by its own terms at the end of Adams' term, but that was the nation that Jefferson was taking over on day one. One of the most interesting things I learned in my research is during his 8 years as president, Thomas Jefferson gave a grand total of 2 speeches. The only 2 speeches he gave were his inaugural addresses for his first term and his second term. But they were good ones. And for that first inaugural address, coming out of the Sedition Act and the Adams presidency, Jefferson started by saying, look, folks, we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans, i.e. we're all Americans, and we better start acting that way or this country is not going to last. And then Jefferson went to work with this special gift of interpersonal persuasion 2 to 3 times every single week during his 8-year presidency, he would host a dinner around a table like you have in your dining commons. And he'd have Republicans and he'd have Federalists and he'd serve lots of wine and great food. But there was one rule. We are not going to talk about hot button political issues. We're going to talk about history. We're going to talk about literature, music, what you do for a living, your family situation. In other words, we're going to talk about the things that people talk about when they're trying to make friends. And Jefferson was famously very charming. He was the Renaissance man. He was so brilliant. He could talk about agriculture, architecture, politics, history, literature. He spoke 6 languages. He played the violin, and he knew how to orchestrate the conversations at these dinners. And he knew these 2 timeless facts that were the basis for him setting up these dinners. Number 1, politics is all about relationships. Don't we know that in 2024? That because the parties have split in 2 and nobody is willing to cross the aisle with a few notable exceptions, there are no good relationships, and so you have gridlock. Jefferson got that. It was going to be important to build these relationships, and you don't build them in 1 dinner or 3 dinners or 5 dinners. You have to relentlessly keep people in this mode of developing friendships through friendly conversation, and so that's what he did. The other timeless principle is somebody likes you, he'll give you the benefit of the doubt. And if he doesn't, he won't. Don't we know that in 2024? And so Jefferson, at these dinners, was all about, I want people to like me so that they will be in a position to think differently about being open to my ideas for moving the country forward. In his biography of Thomas Jefferson, John Meacham, the Pulitzer Prize winner, said that at the dinners, the president's, quote, social civility, grace, and hospitality softened the strident partisanship as feelings evolved from hostility to at least partial respect. Go back to your room and Google Jefferson dinners. There is now a movement around this country for people to have these types of dinners, to develop their skills in civil discourse and showing mutual respect. You may know people here at Presbyterian Village North who from time to time you disagree with on politics. See if you can sit down with them, maybe drink some wine, eat some food, but talk and develop the friendships. I think you'll realize that over time, just as Jefferson, the walls will start coming down. And look at Jefferson's success. President for 8 years, followed by his best friend Madison, 8 years, followed by his little brother figure Monroe, 8 years. Then Quincy Adams has a little 4-year window, but then 8 more years with Andrew Jackson. So in the 19th century, the first 36 years, 32 years were Jefferson and his progeny. So if you want to lead and persuade like Jefferson, ask yourself, what am I doing at building and improving relationships with those, particularly those who from time to time disagree with me? The third great president. Oh, wait, got the wrong PowerPoint. Never mind. I'm going to talk about Lincoln now, but this is a PowerPoint I use another day. Lincoln, our most eloquent president. How did he get to be so eloquent? You ever ask yourself that question? Here's a guy who had less than 1 year of formal schooling, and it was when he was a child, a little blab school where all the kids are talking at the same time, and nobody's learning anything. That was the only schooling he ever got. He never went to high school, he never went to college, he never went to law school, and yet he's our most eloquent president. How did he do it? Well, he did 3 things over the course of his lifetime in terms of regular activities. Number 1, starting as a child, he was a voracious reader. Now, as you know, he grew up poor family, and everybody who lived around him was poor. Nobody had bookshelves full of books. Most houses had 3 or 4 books. But the good news is they were all great books. They were the King James Bible. There were Shakespeare's plays. There were books of the classic poets. There were Aesop's fables. And Lincoln read and reread and reread, and he had a photographic memory. And so with this wonderful, timelessly elegant language gained from these books, he can incorporate the words into his conversations and into his speeches. His second activity is, he was a great lawyer for 23 years in Springfield, both as a trial and an appellate lawyer. And from being a lawyer, he learned two things that helped enhance his capacity to be eloquent. Number one, he learned how to frame an argument. Anybody who's ever thought about how am I going to persuade what I think is important to whoever may be on the other side, it's all about at the outset figuring out how best to frame the argument. And secondly, as a lawyer, he learned that when you're talking to different groups of people, you need to talk differently. You talk different to a jury than you do to a judge, than you do to a witness, than you do to a client, than you do to opposing counsel. And so when he's talking to a group of farmers, he's talking like farmers. When he's talking to successful New York businessmen, like he did at the Cooper Union speech, he's talking like they do. And then third and finally, in terms of activity that caused him to be so eloquent, was the politician. He first ran for political office when he was 23 years old. He basically was running for political office almost his entire adult life, which meant he was giving speeches constantly. And for him, practice made perfect. But besides those activities that caused him to be eloquent, he also was smart enough to realize there are certain rhetorical principles that if they are applied, your words are more likely to hit the bullseye. And that was his special skill. I've identified 5 of them. First of all, he was obsessed with word precision. I'm sure each of you in high school or college came across Shrunken White's The Elements of Style. And that book can be summarized into 8 words. 1, say exactly what you mean. Dash, dash. Don't be vague. Don't be ambiguous. Say what you mean and make it clear. And secondly, eliminate unnecessary words. What do I mean by that? The Gettysburg Address took 2.5 minutes to deliver and has 272 words. I spoke at Gettysburg earlier this year, a wonderful new museum, great documentary on the Gettysburg Address. The narrator said, in less than 3 minutes, he changed the soul of a nation. His famous second inaugural address, his Sermon on the Mount, historians call it, 702 words. It took him a little over 5 minutes to deliver. And of those 702 words, over 500 of them were one syllable. Airtight, short, potent, maximum impact, clear. You say, okay, how do you do that? Well, the answer is relentless editing. He didn't write the Gettysburg Address in the final version as his first draft, or his third draft, or his 5th draft. The metaphor I use is the screwdriver. With each turn of the screwdriver, that screw gets tighter and tighter and tighter. Same when you're working on a paper or a speech. Every time you read through that from beginning to end and you're identifying, I don't need that word. That phrase isn't as clear as I can make it. That's what Lincoln was all about. Obsession with word precision. Secondly, like Washington, he never misrepresented or overstated anything. Remember his nickname, Honest Abe. Again, you could take his words to the bank. Third, he knew how to build rapport with audiences by using wit and telling stories. He didn't overdo it. He didn't try to be a comedian, but work in a little humor throughout your remarks. Get a few smiles going. You're building rapport. Persuasion climax. He delivered it in a tone that was earnest and impassioned, but never emotional. I'm sure many of you saw Steven Spielberg's film Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis, Academy Award-winning role, earnest, impassioned, but not emotional at crunch time. And then 5th and finally, and if you don't remember anything else I say today, particularly as you hopefully want to share it with your family, remember this one, number 5. Lincoln understood that if his words had any likelihood of being remembered, they would need to have a certain rhythm. That means he understood that if they're going to be remembered, you have to talk slowly, not rat-a-tat-tat machine gun-like. One of my pet peeves is when I go to a funeral or a wedding and somebody, a teenager, a young adult, whoever it is, gets asked to read Scripture. And they read the Scripture as fast as they possibly can in a monotone. And I say to myself, why did they waste their time, my time, everybody's time? Because when you're talking too fast, words don't even enter the ear. Never mind get to the brain where they can resonate, reverberate, and penetrate. Lincoln understood how important word rhythm was. Remember how the Gettysburg Address ends. This nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And this government, of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Rhythm. Many of you, I'm sure, have read David McCullough's wonderful books. And I had the privilege of interviewing David several times when he came through Dallas on his book tours. He died a couple of years ago, as I'm sure you know. But he told me one of his secrets. He said every time he finished a chapter and was ready to send it to his publisher, there was one last thing he had to do, and that is he had to go in his living room and have his wife read it aloud to him so he could satisfy himself that the words on the page had the desired rhythm, so as to, in fact, enter the brain and resonate. So if you want to lead and persuade like Lincoln, think about word rhythm. Think about integrity, credibility. Think about impassioned, earnest, but not emotional. Think about using wit, but don't try to be a comedian. These were his word power traits. Our next great president, Theodore Roosevelt. Now, I'm sure all of you have heard that when he was aspiring to be president, he famously said that if you're the president of the United States, all of a sudden you have the power of the bully pulpit. And throughout his presidency, he preached from the bully pulpit. But unfortunately, he did not get the memo from Lincoln about the importance of word rhythm, such that he spoke too fast, he was too brilliant for most people to be processing all this information so fast. And so for the most part, his public remarks are not remembered the way Lincoln's are. But he did have one special talent as a persuader, and that was he was an incredibly effective mediator. Now, I know we got a lot of lawyers in the room who know what mediation is. Perhaps you have participated in mediation, but just in case, mediation is when two sides are at war. They may be involved in a real war, it may be a lawsuit war, whatever it may be, and they're getting nowhere in trying to find ways to bring an end to the war and have peace. And so a neutral enters the dialogue and has the skills to work with both sides to come up and find an area of common ground that they can agree upon that will serve as the basis of resolution. And that was Theodore Roosevelt's special skill. He did have a dynamic personality. If Theodore Roosevelt is in your face and talking to you, it was hard to disagree with him for long. And so he had been president for 1 year when all of a sudden there was a great national coal strike. All the coal miners went on strike. And over a period of months, they would talk with the owners of the coal companies from time to time, but they weren't getting anywhere. And winter was coming. And if they didn't bring an end to the strike, then people all over the country were going to be freezing to death because they didn't have coal. Never before had an American president gotten involved in a labor dispute. But Theodore Roosevelt knew that if he didn't get in there, this was going to be a national disaster. And so he called the leaders of the coal miners and the leaders of the coal companies into the White House, talked to both, listened to both, brainstormed with both, and ultimately came upon this common ground with them agreeing to binding arbitration regarding the issues that had caused the strike to arise. Strike's over, nobody freezes to death. Word goes around the world. This President of the United States has a special skill. If he can get that coal strike ended, he can do anything. So a couple of years later, Japan and Russia are at war. They are killing each other. They have no idea how to bring an end to this war. So they call on President Theodore Roosevelt. Can you do for us what you did in this coal strike? And he said, yes, and they talked, and he found an area of common ground. He brought an end to the war and won the Nobel Peace Prize. A year later, another dispute in Morocco. Again, he achieved settlement. A couple years later, at the Hague Convention in the Netherlands. As Doris Kearns Goodwin, in her biography of Theodore Roosevelt, the title The Bully Pulpit, described his powers as a mediator this way. He used his unusual powers of concentration, his rich cadre of ideas. He's probably our highest IQ president. He wrote more books than any president. He read more books than any president. He had a photographic memory. He remembered everything he'd ever read. So when you're that brilliant, you can think of all kinds of creative ideas regarding potential resolution that nobody else thinks of. He also used his ruthless single-mindedness. I'm not thinking about anything about settlement. That's the only thing I'm thinking about, settlement. Together with his warmth, he knew he kind of had to maintain a certain likability to get people to sign off on what he was pushing them to sign off on. His unabashed intensity and his pluck of personality to move people toward settlement. So if you want to lead and persuade like Theodore Roosevelt, are you in the business of proactively mediating when discord and friction arises in your organization? Our next great president, Franklin Roosevelt. FDR, in fact, was the way I started this speech. Somebody who could speak to the masses and people would come around to his way of thinking, and he was good at it in two different ways. Number one, as a great public orator with that high energy, vigor, snap, crackle, and pop delivery that perhaps some of you saw or you've seen the YouTubes, that famous first inaugural address, March 1933. The country's in the middle of the Great Depression. People are hungry. People are homeless. People are desperate. And he says at that opening address, first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. I.e., I'm not afraid of the depression. You don't need to be afraid of the depression. We got this. I know my predecessor, Hoover, didn't do enough to get things turned around, but you're in good hands, and I can do it. Vigor, energy, pizzazz. But he also had a second way of communicating to the masses with equal effectiveness, and that was using a calm conversational delivery, which is what he used in his famous fireside chats on the radio. And it didn't take long for him to have to put it to use. He had been president a grand total of 8 days when he gave his first fireside chat. What brought that on? Well, he starts off day one, this great inaugural address. People are thinking, I think we got the right president, but they're still hurting, they're still desperate, and so there's a run on the banks. Everybody pulls all the money out of their accounts. They take it home. They stick it in a mattress. And in response to that, Roosevelt closes all the banks the next day and declares it a national bank holiday. And then a couple of days later, he has his first fireside chat, and in a calm, conversational voice says, look, folks, here's what we've done. Here's why we did it. And by that, I mean he had closed all the banks. What in the heck? Nobody ever closed all the banks and declared a bank holiday when it wasn't a holiday. Here's what we've done. Here's why we did it. Here's what we're going to do going forward. There's no reason to panic. We got this under control. We're going to beat this. We're going to open the banks again tomorrow. And I want you to take the money out of your mattresses and redeposit in the banks. And they followed his advice. If he come on with that high energy, high vigor, no. But if people are sitting in their living rooms, listening to their radios, hearing this calm conversational voice, it's sunk in and say, I can go with that. I'm okay with that. Do you want to persuade like Franklin Roosevelt? Do you know the circumstances when you want to talk with high vigor and energy? And when you want to be more talking with a calmness and a conversational voice? But for both of these types of persuasion, he was effective because, as well or better than any president with the possible exception of Lincoln, he had his finger on the pulse of the American mindset. Not just part of the American mindset, the entire country. He knew what the country was thinking. How do you do that? Well, number one, throughout his presidency, he had a steady stream of press conferences. And he didn't say, I'm only going to talk to people from one newspaper to the other. I'm only going to talk with people from one radio station. Nothing. No. Everybody's welcome. Ask all your questions. I'm happy to answer them. If you're asking those questions, the American people have it on their mind. I want to get that kind of dialogue going with the American people. Don't you wish we had that today? In addition, he and his wife were always canvassing the country on car and train trips, always in a listening mode. And in particular, Eleanor was on the road basically the whole 12 plus years of his presidency. And so she would come back to Washington from time to time and tell her husband, here's what the people of Arizona are thinking. Here's what the people of Michigan are thinking. Here's what the people of Texas are thinking. In addition, to keep his finger on the pulse of the American people, he followed the newly emerging industry of public opinion polls very carefully. Whatever was coming out of there, it was based on something. I want to know what those polls are showing. And then finally, he made it a point of scheduling regular meetings with the leaders of both political parties. I want to know what their agenda is. I want to know what's behind it. I want to dialogue with them. So if you want to persuade like Franklin Roosevelt, what are you doing to keep your finger on the pulse of whatever group it is you're trying to lead? But once Franklin Roosevelt knew what the people were thinking, he knew that many times it's different from what he thought they should be thinking. And so it was his job to move the needle to get them aligned with where he thought the country needed to go. And in particular, on major issues, he said, you don't just in the first minute say, here's this dramatic change we now need to implement immediately. No, you deliver a message over time, incrementally, to give people to reprocess, reflect, and come around and grasp where you're trying to get them to go. And this was demonstrated particularly in the late 30s and early 40s. Hitler is in the process of taking over Europe. He defeats France. Churchill and Britain can't possibly beat Hitler. They know that. They're begging FDR in America to enter the war so they have somebody capable of beating Hitler. But FDR knew he couldn't do it yet. Why? Because most of the American people were locked in a mindset of isolationism, led by American hero Charles Lindbergh. We don't want to go halfway across the world and fight a war. We did that before 20 years ago in World War I. We don't want to do that again. But Franklin Roosevelt said, no. He said to himself, if we stay stuck in this mode of isolationism, Hitler's going to be taking over more and more countries, be more and more emboldened. He's not only going to take over Europe, he'll take over Asia, Africa, Australia, the high seas, and then he'll be coming at us. And so we can't just stay locked in an isolation mindset. We're going to have to do our part or this guy's going to try to take over the world. So his means of moving the needle of public sentiment incrementally was again with his fireside chats. To the American people, the buzzword, the trigger that they never wanted to hear him say was the word war. They figured he's advocating we get involved in that war. We don't want to go to that war. He knew that. So in the fireside chat early on, he says, look, folks, this is not a fireside chat about war. It is a talk on national security. Now that's a softer word. It ultimately means the same thing, but because it's softer, they're not set off with the trigger of the word, he's trying to encourage us to go to war. No. I care about national security. I want to hear what he's got to say. Then in a later chat, as Hitler continues to have success and Germany's reach around the world gets larger and larger, he said, look, folks, the war is now approaching the brink of the Western Hemisphere itself. It's coming very close to home. Anyone with an atlas, anyone with a reasonable knowledge of the sudden striking force of modern war knows that you can't wait until a probable enemy has gained a foothold from which to attack. Now, how could anybody argue with that? And so his words, messaged strategically, step by step over time, caused America to rethink its commitment, to isolationism and move to an attitude of understanding how important that we be players sooner rather than later and support the idea of internationalism. So if you want to persuade like Franklin Roosevelt, when it's time to communicate a major change in the course at wherever your organization, don't do it all at once. Do it incrementally so people will come around, process, and accept your point of view. Our sixth great president, Dwight Eisenhower. Now, I'm sure all of you heard Dwight Eisenhower, and you know that like Washington, Jefferson, and Theodore Roosevelt, he was not a particularly great public speaker. And yet, historians rank him now as our fifth greatest president, behind Lincoln, Washington, and both Roosevelts. How is that possible? Well, the answer is every time Dwight Eisenhower set a goal for his administration during his presidency, by golly, he found ways to persuade people to get it done, and he achieved it. On his desk in the Oval Office was an engraved block of wood that epitomized his style of leadership: gently in manner, strongly in deed. And in particular, when it came time, a crisis had arisen, and he knew he had to come up with a plan to deal with it. He knew the circumstances when it was going to take some time to implement the plan and have the success he desired, and thus would require patience. But he also knew there are certain circumstances where you got to move quickly and play hardball. So in terms of the situation when he demonstrated patience in achieving his goal, it was the McCarthy era, the Red Scare. You remember that Joseph McCarthy had become famous during Truman's presidency with the bogus claim that our State Department was infiltrated by communists without any real facts to support it, and yet a lot of people believed him. And his stature was rising. And Truman's approach was to insult him, call him a liar, call him a fool, don't pay any attention, and all that did was cause McCarthy's stature to go up. Eisenhower realized, I got to do something different. What Harry Truman tried didn't work. He said, I'm never even going to say McCarthy's name in public. I'm going to come up with a strategic plan that's going to take a little time, but that will give McCarthy enough rope to hang himself. And it all culminated in the Army-McCarthy hearings a year into Eisenhower's presidency, and the guy who brought McCarthy down was Army's lawyer Joseph Welch, and Eisenhower never even had to get his hands dirty. Now, an example of Eisenhower's knowing when it was time to move quickly and play hardball came a month before his election for his second term, October 1956, when our long-established allies, Britain, France, and Israel, joined forces, invaded Egypt, and seized the Suez Canal. And they did it even though Eisenhower had said beforehand, don't do that. Do not do that. You're thereby inviting the Soviet Union into the Middle East. You're going to disrupt the current balance of power in the Middle East. Don't do that. And they did it anyway. They thought they could get away with it. As soon as they did it, Eisenhower went immediately to the United Nations, got severe economic sanctions imposed against the three nations. Those sanctions caused them all of a sudden, they couldn't get oil. Hey, President Eisenhower, can you help us out? We need some more oil. Sorry, you should have thought about that before you invaded Egypt and the Suez. It also totally disrupted their economies. Hey, President Eisenhower, can you get us some dollars to help us stabilize the British pound? Sorry, you should have thought about that before you invaded Egypt and the Suez. And so this resulted in a ceasefire in the Suez, but they refused to remove their troops. And that really ticked Eisenhower off. And so he called his Secretary of the Treasury. He said, I want you to go into the marketplace and I want you to buy up every British pound that you can buy. And he did. And once he did that, Eisenhower then called the British Prime Minister and said, if you don't get all those troops out of the Suez right now, I'm going to drive your pound's value down to zero. That's how you play hardball. Those troops were removed in a nanosecond. So if you want to persuade like Dwight Eisenhower, you need to know when is the time for a deliberate, strategic plan that requires patience, and when is the time to move quickly and play hardball. Our seventh great president, John F. Kennedy. Now, there may be many in this room who say, my goodness, Kennedy, he wasn't even president for 3 full years. He was only president for 1,000 days. How in the world can he be ranked as one of our greatest presidents? And the answer is because like Lincoln, like Franklin Roosevelt, like Ronald Reagan, Kennedy had the power of words that would move the nation to do the right things time and again during his almost 3-year presidency. It started with his inaugural address, January 1961. I'm sure you all remember it. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And within a couple of months, he creates the Peace Corps. And a few months after that, tens of thousands of young Americans go abroad to third world countries, help them with all they need help on. America's public relations around the world is enhanced, all tied to that strong inaugural address. A year later, the space race is going on, and we're losing. The Soviet Union is beating us, and the reason is because Congress will not provide the funding we need to compete with the Russians in the space race. And so Kennedy gets this great idea, the American Moonshot Program. We're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. That's going to capture the public imagination, which will move them to get their legislators off the dime and provide the funding we need to win this space race. And in 1962, he gave a speech at Rice Stadium in Houston and said in it, quote, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills." And shortly after that speech, Congress started funding the space program, doing what it took to put us in a position. And in fact, we succeeded in getting a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And then the third area where he moved the nation toward the right direction was probably the most important, and that was civil rights. You remember in the early 1960s, there were protests going on all over the country, riots going on all over the country. And the most famous was in Birmingham in April 1963, where Sheriff Bull Connor pulled out fire hoses and blasted little black children who were with their parents in the protest, and then unleashed dozens of vicious attack dogs on the protesters. And it was all on national television, and Kennedy saw it, and he said he was sickened. And 2 months later, Governor George Wallace stands at the front door of the University of Alabama and says, "We're not going to let blacks in the University of Alabama." Kennedy sees that, and that's the straw that breaks the camel's back. That night, he goes on television and gives a speech that was largely extemporaneous. And for the first time, an American president told the country, this issue of civil rights and bringing an end to Jim Crow is no longer a political issue, it is a moral issue. In that address, he said, quote, "We face a moral crisis as a country and as a people. It is time to act in the Congress, in your state and local legislative body, and above all, in our daily lives. A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all." And a couple of days later, for the first time, an American president submits a strong civil rights bill to Congress. And Kennedy then moves to push it through, but he's assassinated before he can get it through. Fortunately, his successor, Lyndon Johnson, pushes the ball over the goal line. July 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that brought an end to Jim Crow. And so you ask yourself, what was it? What was it about these speeches that moved the nation as quickly and powerful and in the right direction the way Kennedy's did? And one of his biographers, Stephen Knott, says here was the key to his success. He always made sure that his words appealed to the better angels of our nature, those famous magic words from Lincoln's first inaugural address, the better angels of our nature, he was appealing to people's better angels as opposed to their dark sides, like politicians in the 21st century do. So if you want to persuade like John F. Kennedy, ask yourself, when it comes time for me to try to persuade somebody, am I appealing to their better angels or to their dark sides? And then our eighth and last great president, Ronald Reagan, you remember, who entered the White House after the disastrous presidency of Jimmy Carter, where there was double-digit inflation, high unemployment, low economic growth, long gas lines, and American hostages were seized in Iran and we couldn't get them freed. America was in a state of national malaise. We needed somebody to bring us back to American exceptionalism and remember our past and believe in our future, and that person was Ronald Reagan. And the key to Reagan's capacity to move the nation was not only his personal optimism, but his capacity to inspire optimism throughout the country. If you study the growing up of Ronald Reagan, there was nothing for him to be optimistic about. His parents had little money. They moved from rent house to rent house. His father was a horrible alcoholic. Fortunately, he had a strong, wonderful mother who kept encouraging him, and he spent a life just improving his lot year by year for the most part. But because of this optimism and his communication skills, he said things repeatedly with a contagious conviction that made people believe that this is the way forward. Saying things like, quote, "We are too great a nation to limit ourselves to small dreams." Quote, "We're here to do whatever it takes." Quote, "America should always be a shining city on a hill. My strategy for the Cold War, we win, they lose." On his Oval Office desk, piece of leather embroidered, "It can," all caps, C-A-N, "it can be done." Quote, I don't have just a strong faith in God, I have a strong faith in man." And last quote, "The difference between an American and any other kind of person is that an American lives in anticipation of the future because he knows the future is going to be a great place." So it was that kind of optimism, driven home month after month, year after year, never wavered. And then he followed through. And in fact, brought an end to the Cold War, revived the American economy, restored America's self-confidence, restored the world's belief in America as a great nation. That was the achievement of Ronald Reagan. Why Pulitzer finalist H.W. Brands at the University of Texas says, what Franklin Roosevelt was to the first half of the 20th century, Reagan was to the second half. Pessimists don't move mountains. Only optimists move mountains. So if you want to persuade like Ronald Reagan, ask yourself, how am I doing at inspiring optimism in my group? So, my friends, Presbyterian Village North, now you've heard what the best did in terms of being successful persuaders. Washington, persuasion as an accomplished command presence with unwavering integrity, who knew when and when not to speak to maintain unity. Jefferson, persuasion as a relentless relationship builder, particularly with people who he knew didn't always agree with him. Lincoln, persuasion by maximizing his word power through clarity, sincerity, and precision. Theodore Roosevelt, persuasion as a mediator with the power to find common ground between conflicting factions. Franklin Roosevelt, persuasion, knowing when to speak forcefully and when to speak calmly, and knowing what the public sentiment was and how to move it incrementally. Eisenhower, persuasion, knowing when to be patient and when to move quickly and play hardball. Kennedy, persuasion, by inspiring us to be guided by the better angels of our nature and not our dark sides. And finally, Reagan, persuasion, driven by constant, sincere optimism. So now that you know how the best did it, you think of ways to use it and share it in your families to enhance and grow the leadership persuasion repertoire that you have. Thank you.